On a quiet Sunday afternoon in downtown Cleveland on March 24th, 2013, 53-year-old Aliza Sherman walked toward her divorce attorney's office, expecting a routine meeting. Instead, she was ambushed and brutally stabbed just steps from the entrance in broad daylight. A grainy surveillance camera clip offered the only glimpse of the perpetrator, a blurred, masked figure dressed in dark clothing sprinting away from the scene. The motive behind this case, if the prosecution's allegations are correct, will go down as one of the most unusual motives in American criminal justice history. Detectives quickly honed in on Aliza's personal life for possible motives. The victim had been in the midst of a messy divorce with her estranged husband, Sanford Sherman, at the time of her death. This bitter legal battle had dragged on for years, and friends later recounted that Aliza was afraid and just wanted it over with. Naturally, Sanford came under scrutiny, but when police attempted to interview him, he refused to cooperate, hiring an attorney who shielded him from questioning. Investigators could never formally label him a suspect, and with no direct evidence tying him to the attack, that lead hit a dead end. Years later, Sanford would pass away in Florida, never having answered detectives' questions. The cloud of suspicion remained, but if he knew more about Aliza's death, he took those secrets to his grave. Under normal conditions, the authorities may have spent way more in the way of resources investigating Sanford, but this case was anything but normal. Another early focus of the investigation was Aliza's own divorce attorney, Gregory Moore, the very man she was on her way to meet. Almost immediately, something about Moore's behavior didn't sit right with Aliza's friends or the police. Aliza's best friend later revealed that on the day of the attack, Moore had oddly kept changing the meeting time and location for their appointment. This constant rescheduling raised questions about whether Aliza had been deliberately lured into a trap, and this is where things get really weird. Moore told investigators that he hadn't been at his downtown office at the time of the attack, but was somewhere else entirely. They found this to be unusual given that this is where he was supposed to meet his client at that exact time. Deepening suspicions, forensic analysis of cell phone records and building entry logs would later catch him in a web of deceit. Moore had sent text messages to Aliza just moments before and after the attack, claiming he was waiting inside his office, contrary to what he told the cops. Yet investigators discovered he was not actually in the building at that time based on the building entry logs. This contradiction was alarming. Aliza's own attorney had attempted to fabricate some sort of alibi, while also telling an obvious verifiable lie to the authorities. At the crime scene, other strange clues, or lack thereof, emerged. Besides the blurry video footage, physical evidence was scant. The attacker had been quick and efficient, leaving behind no weapon, and initially, no identifiable DNA or fingerprints. But investigators did notice anomalies that suggested a premeditated effort, likely involving multiple people. Critical surveillance footage from the building, about 20 minutes worth, had mysteriously been deleted immediately after the attack. Similarly, voicemails from the building's calling system, which Aliza might have used to reach Moore upon arrival, were found to have been erased. Taken together, it was very clear these weren't random glitches. They looked like deliberate acts of evidence tampering, and it appeared that someone with access had tried to blind the investigation from the very start. This was a devastating setback for detectives. In those first critical weeks, leads were scarce, and even some of the most crucial evidence had literally been wiped away by unknown accomplices. As the months turned into years, Aliza Sherman's case languished without an arrest. Investigators faced repeated dead ends and frustrating missteps that stalled progress. Gregory Moore, who remained a person of interest, continued to practice law for a time, giving an unfortunate double meaning to the term criminal attorney. In 2016, more than 3 years after the event, a grand jury finally indicted Moore, but not for the slaying itself, but for charges related to obstructing the investigation. He had lied to police about his whereabouts and role on the day of the attack, and investigators had uncovered even more unsettling behavior. Moore had a history of making bogus bomb threats to delay court proceedings. In fact, back in 2012, he had phoned in bomb scares to courthouse buildings as a tactic to postpone trials. This revelation painted a picture of a man seemingly terrified of facing courtroom showdowns and willing to commit crimes to avoid them. And hang tight, because this is what we call foreshadowing. By 2017, Moore pleaded guilty to charges of falsification for his lies to detectives and inducing panic for the bomb threats. He served a mere 6 months in jail, but this family attorney was thankfully quickly divorced from his license to practice law. However, with no further charges filed at the time, Moore walked free after his short jail stint, and the specter of Aliza's unsolved case continued to haunt investigators and her family. Behind the scenes, Cleveland detectives kept the file open, but were running out of angles. By 2021, with the 10-year mark approaching and the case still unsolved, the Cleveland police took a pivotal step. They handed the case over to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. The idea was to get fresh eyes and cutting-edge forensic technology involved. BCI's cold case unit, under the State Attorney General's office, had resources and analytical tools beyond the scope of the local department. This unit approached the case methodically, re-examining every piece of evidence and applying new technological techniques in DNA and digital forensics. Crucially, they were determined to find something that had been missed in the earlier investigation, and bit by bit, the cold case began to warm up. What local investigators had long suspected, the BCI team set out to prove. Cell phone technology, in particular, provided the long-awaited breakthrough. Every time a phone pings a cell tower or connects to Wi-Fi, it leaves a trace. Investigators discovered that on the day of the attack, Gregory Moore's phone behavior was anything but normal. For a critical 3-hour window around the time of Aliza's death, Moore's cell phone went dark. He had deliberately disconnected it from the network. This was a calculated move to avoid creating any cell tower location records placing him near the crime scene. To seasoned detectives, that kind of silence spoke volumes. It was as if an invisible alarm bell rang. An ordinary person has no reason to power off their phone for the duration of an event such as this, unless they're trying to hide something. It made even less sense for Moore since he was a practicing lawyer at the time, and going dark while working made no sense, even if it was on a Sunday. The BCI team pieced together that right after the time of the stabbing, Moore powered his phone back on. While the initial investigators knew he made efforts to reach her right after, they didn't know that his phone had been off until a few moments after the completion of the deed. Notably, in the days following the slaying, Moore went so far as to obtain a new phone altogether, presumably to distance himself from any records on the old device. Such actions demonstrated an unusual level of planning and consciousness of guilt. Digital evidence wasn't the only puzzle piece that BCI re-examined. They revisited surveillance systems and building access logs with fresh scrutiny. Moore's keycard swipe into his office building was logged later that same evening after Aliza had been slain. This suggested he returned to the scene not long after the crime, possibly to retrieve evidence or verify that evidence had been destroyed by those who helped him out. With all that said, I led off by telling you the motive would be unusual, so let's get to it. Prosecutors now allege that Moore's motive was straightforward and disturbing. He wanted to delay or derail the divorce trial that was set to begin that week. This was a trial he was unprepared for or afraid to face, and as noted, he previously called in bomb threats to avoid trials. This educated professional allegedly concluded that slaying his own client was the solution to his problems. As mentioned, Moore had a documented history of drastic delay tactics, and in Aliza's case, investigators say he went to the most extreme act possible. The plan, according to the prosecutor's allegations, was originally to kidnap Aliza Sherman as a delay tactic to prevent her from appearing in court. Along the way, something went horribly wrong. Prosecutors believe that Moore changed his plans for reasons which are yet unknown. After 12 long years of uncertainty, the hard work of the cold case investigators finally paid off. In early May 2025, a Cuyahoga County grand jury reviewed the mountain of new evidence and returned a secret indictment charging Gregory Moore. Armed with this indictment, law enforcement moved swiftly. On May 24, 2025, the disgraced lawyer was extradited back to Ohio in handcuffs, ready to face the consequences of his alleged deeds. When the news of Moore's arrest broke, it sent shockwaves through Cleveland. At a court hearing in late May 2025, Moore, now 51 years old, pleaded not guilty to all charges. A judge ordered him held on a $2 million bond and demanded a DNA sample, while also forbidding any contact with the Sherman family. For now, Moore awaits trial and remains innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. It was just after midnight on September 2, 1995, when Richard Martin was forced out of Nancy's Bar, a local tavern along Highway 81 in Williamston, South Carolina. He had been ejected by bar staff for being too intoxicated. Outside in the parking lot, another patron from that night, a local man named Bobby McLean, was lingering. Inside, witnesses later recalled seeing Richard dance with a woman, which had made McLean jealous. That simple conflict over a dance was about to turn deadly. Around 1 a.m., Richard was found lying unconscious in the middle of Welcome Road, a dark rural route about 3 miles from the bar. He had been savagely beaten, suffering severe head injuries. First responders rushed him to a hospital, but he never regained consciousness and died later that day. Whoever attacked him fled into the night, leaving behind a gravely injured young man and a baffling mystery, which the authorities claim is now solved. And you'll notice my use of the word claimed here, since I see some pretty big issues with this claim. I'm going to break down the official version of the narrative here, and then I'm going to pick apart the evidence that was used to put that narrative together. Detectives arrived at the scene and immediately began to zero in on McLean. The attack on Richard seemed targeted and vicious. The autopsy confirmed he'd been struck multiple times in the head with a blunt object. The weapon was never found, but investigators suspected that it was a heavy club, based on the nature of Richard's injuries. That suspicion pointed to Bobby McLean, who was widely known to carry around a baton and have a violent temper. From the very beginning, McLean was the prime suspect. McLean was questioned soon after the attack. He claimed that after leaving the bar, Richard got into a car with other men, an account that the authorities claim witnesses later disproved. According to the authorities, no evidence ever supported the involvement of any mystery men. McLean's apparent false statements only heightened suspicions that he was covering up his own guilt. Investigators even had McLean take a polygraph test, which he failed. But of course, a lie detector alone isn't nearly enough to make a case, and doesn't really detect lies regardless. Still, in 1995, the sheriff's office believed they lacked the hard evidence to arrest him. It's important to remember that the prosecution only has one chance to take a run at a suspect, and they have to prove the offense beyond a reasonable doubt. In our system, the burden of proof remains entirely on the prosecutors to prove that McLean committed the attack. This left the authorities in a tough position. They knew they almost certainly had their guy, but they just didn't have the evidence they needed. There were no eyewitnesses to the beating and no forensic proof tying McLean directly to the crime. With only circumstantial clues and a suspect who denied everything, the trail grew cold and Richard's case lingered unsolved. In 2017, Anderson County Sheriff Sergeant Scotty Hill took a fresh look at the case. He found the case file cluttered with decades of rumors and misinformation, so he worked to strip away the hearsay and zero in on solid facts. The passage of time posed its own challenges, and many people originally involved had moved away or even died. Hill refocused the investigation on the bar where Richard was last seen and the man long suspected to be responsible, Bobby McLean. As Hill's team re-examined witness statements and reports, they uncovered crucial evidence that they claim had been overlooked. They claimed, for instance, that McLean's 1995 alibi was fabricated from start to finish. They also claimed that the story about Richard leaving with other men was false, though the authorities didn't indicate that anyone had seen him leave with McLean. Investigators also found witnesses who indicated that McLean was carrying a club with him on the night of the attack. While before he had been known to carry a club, this evidence suggested he was actually carrying a club on the night in question. Investigators revisited the autopsy findings and determined that he had been bludgeoned with a club. Notably, they couldn't arrest McLean since he had died of unknown causes 15 years prior. On May 13, 2025, the sheriff held a press conference to announce the conclusion of the Richard Martin case, where they claimed that McLean was undeniably the perpetrator. Investigators explained that the likely motive for the attack was simple jealousy. A minor barroom dispute based on a dance with a woman McLean desired had exploded into a fatal encounter. Investigators believe McLean ambushed Richard as some sick form of payback, and the rest is history. Personally, I have some serious problems with this conclusion, and I question whether they would have made such an announcement if McLean was alive. Also, I'm about to go off on a bit of a rant here, and I want to know what your thoughts on the evidence against McLean are in the comments below. I'll start at the tip of the iceberg and point out the obvious. No forensic evidence from Richard's body ties McLean to the beating, and investigators still admit the blunt instrument used in the attack was never recovered. Further, detectives lean on the fact that McLean was known to carry such a weapon and was seen with one in his possession. Yet plenty of bar bouncers and other locals owned similar weapons in the 1990s, and we know that Richard was ejected for being too intoxicated. Further, every witness places McLean inside or outside the bar, not on Welcome Road where the beating happened. If the prosecution actually had to prove this case, they would have to build a timeline that moves McLean, undetected, 3 miles away. Notably, the entire theory rests on McLean allegedly growing angry when Richard danced with a woman. No witness recalls an earlier physical altercation between the two men that night. It's not as though the two got into a physical or verbal altercation in the bar and then took it outside. Richard was kicked out for being too intoxicated. McLean maintained he wasn't involved, and the only indication that he wasn't telling the truth was a polygraph test, which doesn't actually test for lies or deception regardless. Further, there's a lot of reliance on the memory of patrons of a bar 30 years ago, which is problematic for a number of reasons. I may shock some of you here, but people tend to be intoxicated in bars, and people who are drinking generally don't have the most accurate memory of events. Add in the passage of 30 years, I suspect these memories could have been influenced by the investigative process itself, which brings me to the next problem. The investigators and witnesses will never have to be subjected to cross-examination by defense counsel, since there will never be a trial. Essentially, this key truth-finding element has been entirely removed from the process, and now we're expected to take 30-year-old eyewitness testimony at face value. Again, these are people who were out and intoxicated, and have also been subjected to 30 years of the rumor mill as well. Further, detectives claim McLean volunteered crime scene facts during the initial investigation that only the perpetrator would know. However, if this was true, then this is essentially an admission that the initial investigation was fumbled. If they had all the circumstantial evidence at the time, and they also had McLean admitting to things only the perp could have known, then he ought to have been arrested in '95. Officers now say McLean's 1995 statement that Richard left with other men was fabricated, but they've never explained how they came to this conclusion. They haven't identified the people who supposedly contradicted the story, nor provided a timeline showing McLean's whereabouts while Richard was assaulted. Because McLean died in 2010, investigators can no longer confront him or explore innocent explanations for inconsistencies. Of course, confirmation bias is a real thing as well. McLean was labeled the prime suspect within hours, partly because he was known to carry a baton and had a temper. Once a theory hardens, detectives often look for cues that confirm it and discount those that don't. Once you strip away all the elements of this so-called solved attack, what you have is speculation about a guy who is no longer around to defend himself. Closing Richard Martin's file may comfort his family, and it may even be correct, but the evidence made public so far can't rule out other attackers. This, of course, means that on the basis of the evidence that's been provided thus far, the real perpetrator could still be out there. Anyway, again, let me know in the comments what you think of the evidence against McLean. Maybe I'm missing something here, but the puzzle pieces just aren't fitting together for me. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, don't forget to check out my podcast, Lazy Chill True Crime, by clicking one of the links or by searching it up wherever you get your podcasts. On June 16, 1978, the day after classes ended for summer break at Branham High School in San Jose, California, the campus was nearly empty as teachers cleaned their classrooms. A student in the hallway heard faint cries for help and rushed toward the sound. They found Diane Peterson, a young teacher, lying on the floor near her classroom with a single stab wound to her chest. The attack had occurred in broad daylight inside a school, a shocking and brazen crime that stunned colleagues, students, and the community. Efforts to save Peterson failed, and she succumbed to her wound, leaving the tight-knit school community in shock and grief. Investigators immediately began searching for the perp. Witnesses reported seeing a young man in the hallway around the time of the attack, and police created a composite sketch based on their accounts. Before long, they focused on a 16-year-old student named Nikki Nickerson. Nickerson, a Branham High student, was quickly brought into custody just 4 days after the slaying, as his appearance strongly resembled the composite drawing. Early clues reinforced the suspicions about Nickerson. One witness told police that Nickerson had been seen carrying a knife engraved with the words "Teacher Dear," and even claimed that he confessed to the stabbing. It was a bizarre and chilling detail, hinting at a possible personal obsession with Diane. However, detectives couldn't find any physical evidence or independent confirmation to back up the witness's story. With no forensic proof and only uncorroborated accounts, authorities had to release Nickerson due to a lack of concrete evidence. Despite the initial promising leads, the case remained unsolved. Nickerson's release meant the investigation had hit a wall, and detectives were left without answers. In the years that followed, the investigation saw a few hopeful moments that ultimately fell apart. In 1983, the family of one Branham student, told police their son claimed to have witnessed the attack and identified Nickerson as the culprit. When officers interviewed that student, he recanted his story and denied seeing the crime, dashing that hope. Then in 1984, another witness came forward saying that Nickerson had implicated himself in the slaying and suggested the motive was that Peterson caught him in a substance deal on campus. If true, it meant the slaying may have been a panicked act to silence the teacher after she witnessed his illicit activity. But even this potential motive remained only a theory without corroboration. This allegation hinted at a reason for the attack, but again there was no solid evidence to support it. Each time a lead emerged, it collapsed under scrutiny, and the case grew cold. Detectives also noted that each version of events was very different, suggesting that the rumor mill had simply gone into overdrive. After all, the fact that Nickerson had been held by the cops was public knowledge, so he would of course be the obvious target of such disparate rumors and explanations. For decades, Diane Peterson's case sat among the cold case files with no signs of resolution in sight. In 2011, the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office formed a dedicated cold case unit to re-examine unsolved slayings. This team, which ended up successfully resolving numerous other decades-old cases, turned their attention to Peterson's case. Investigators took a fresh look at the evidence using modern techniques. Between 2023 and 2024, they conducted extensive DNA testing on items from the crime scene, hoping to find a genetic clue to the perpetrator's identity. Unfortunately, the DNA analysis didn't turn up any match or new information, and it turned out the breakthrough would come from classic detective work rather than science. In 2025, as cold case investigators re-interviewed people connected to the case, one of Nickerson's relatives revealed a stunning secret. The family member admitted that on the day of the attack back in 1978, a teenage Nickerson had arrived at their home in a distraught state and confessed to it all. Astonishingly, this confession had never been shared with police until that moment, a key piece of the truth hidden for 47 years. Notably, police had held back a significant amount of information in this case, in the event that someone came forward. The relative's detailed account included specifics that only the perpetrator or police would have known, convincing authorities that the story was genuine. Armed with this new testimony, authorities finally had the evidence they needed to close the case. Investigators carefully verified the relative's account against the facts from the original investigation. The story lined up with the known details of the crime, corroborating the long-held suspicions about Nickerson. In June 2025, officials announced that the 1978 case was officially solved. After nearly half a century, they publicly identified Nickerson as the person who had cruelly ended the life of this beloved teacher. By the time this announcement came, Nickerson was no longer alive to face the music, and the cops announced that he had finished himself off in 1993. Interestingly, as the case concluded, more information emerged about the perpetrator's troubled background. Records showed that in the years after 1978, Nickerson continued to commit violent offenses. He was arrested and convicted on charges including armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and kidnapping. In 1984, he was shot while attempting a robbery, though no charges were filed in that incident for reasons which aren't entirely known at this time. At present, it remains unknown whether his attack on Diane was a one-off anomaly or whether he struck again